So I'm pleased to be able to introduce our first keynote speaker, Josef Perner. Of course, when you need to introduce somebody, you go online and you start looking up things about them that you didn't know. And so when you Google Josef, you get some enormous number of citations, which is crazy. And then you download the CV and you start looking at the number of publications and the books. And when I printed it, it came out with 3 pages, and I thought, well, this is weird. And then I realized that was just the last 3 years, and so I printed the whole one, ran out of paper, so I just said, I'll forget going all the way back to 1970. But I would like to highlight, amongst all of the written work that Josef has done, a book that is now, I guess, almost 20 years old, that I still think is extremely relevant for anyone who's interested in issues related to social cognition, and that's his 1991 book, Understanding the Representational Mind. For any students who are interested in this field, it's worth going back even that far, and there's actually a downloadable link on his website, so it's not illegal, for the book, and I recommend it. But of course, these sorts of achievements don't matter in and of themselves. Of course they matter in themselves, but these sorts of achievements are indicative of the underlying substance that makes, in my judgment, Josef such an excellent researcher. And in particular, I've found that his work is always very theoretically sophisticated. It has very good methodological rigor, and he is statistically conservative all the time. And so for those of you in psychology, I guess you know what I'm talking about. Usually you're happy if you can do one of these things, or maybe 2 of them, very well, but it seems like Josef is able to do all 3 in his work, and I think this is what this is the best of science. One last thing I'd like to highlight is well, Josef and his colleague Wimmer originated the task that became the Maxi task, and then Marco showed the Salian version of it. So there's a sense in which that started a new evolution in studying social cognition. Josef has also been part of the cutting edge of additional new evolutions, whether it's stuff related to explanations or language use, etc. And that continues today. And so it's very interesting to be both one of the originators of the field and on the cutting edge 40 years later. So I'll stop there and let Josef share with us today about mental files in perspective towards a cognitive analysis of theory of mind. Thank you.
So good afternoon, and many thanks to the organizers to invite me to this interesting conference. And not only with that, they even took me on an exciting trip to Cappadocia, last 2 days. And thank you to all of you in here for coming in such big numbers. And that's what I'm going to talk about, mental files in perspective, and towards a cognitive analysis of theory of mind. It's mostly about mental files, but since this is social cognition, I put its relationship to theory of mind as a particular focus. So this is what you will be confronted with. I'll make a 1-slide sort of review about the research the last 40 years or something on theory of mind and what we have achieved. Not much, at least in theoretical terms. We know a lot about what children or adults do. Then I wanted to point out that there is some sort of important change around the age of 4 still. And it has something to do with perspective. So whether it is a visual perspective taking or conceptual or cognitive perspective, it all appears at the same time. But there is one big question when people characterize those things as perspective. Do they actually have the same concept in mind, or what? Yeah, okay. And so help with this problem comes for me from using mental files. Then, since most of you, I take it, are not very familiar with mental files, I will say something brief, the basics about mental files. And in particular, for me, important concept is the linking of co-referential files. Okay, I'll explain what all those fancy terminology means. And then I'll show you a few data, because it's not just sort of theory, but it relates to data. And then on sort of first order problems like belief attribution and other things. And then briefly an extension to second order problems, so when children understand beliefs about beliefs and so on. And then a brief excursion into our work on brain imaging, where the basic question is, was sort of this developmental work shows a commonality in the development of quite different tasks. Can you also find a commonality in the brain structure that deals with those tasks? Okay, so that's the program. So the first thing, brief review of theory of mind. Since most of you know about theory of mind. So what have we achieved in the last so many years? The one basic question is, how do we do it? So there are some basic theories, but we still don't know which one actually applies. As I may remind you, there was the theory. We're using a theory, we do it by simulation. Rationality theory, those are more recent things. No, that's an old one, but in activism is a new one, and Johannes Rössler guy working on teleology as an alternative. So there were those basic questions around from the very beginning. I still, if you ask me which one is right, I couldn't tell you. There's a lot of work, who has it? So one could say, yes, we agree that adults, at least neurotypical adults, and children at 7 months, maybe, or 4 years, or 6 years, or 8 years have it. But maybe who has it partially? There is some evidence that chimps have it, dogs have it, goats have it, ravens have it, including magpies and jays. And so on, but what exactly, which part do they have, how much of it, and so on. So one problem here is that nobody really can give you a clear indication of what is, when do we have a theory of mind. So, but I think at least we know, mostly from philosophical work, what's supposed to be critical about it. That it's important that you can use it to predict behavior, and that you understand perspective. Because the mind is something, at least some philosophers emphasize this, is something that takes a perspective on things, whereas things don't take perspectives on things. Okay. Then another question is, what is the cognitive analysis of all this? So much of the theory of mind work has fallen into the hands of the modularists linked to nativism. So modularists are only interested whether you have or don't have a functioning model that does the work, but nobody is seriously interested in how the module does the work, so no cognitive analysis of the module. And that usually goes with nativism. Because since it's so important, you might as well be endowed with such a module from birth on. Then some people who believe that what we observe, the changes we observe in development, there is genuine change in how what children understand about the mind. Okay, and so there is some conceptual analysis, but it basically is limited to the concepts that we have about the mind. Okay, so you famously is Henry Wellman's claim that we move, or children move around 4 from a pure desire psychology to a belief plus desire psychology. So they acquire the concept of belief later than. So there's some analysis, but what I have been working on is to find a sort of deeper reasons that go beyond or below our concept that we talk about the mind, to see what cognitive processes our concepts are based on. And I sort of approach this in what one could call a Piagetian tradition, that you look at different domains, different tasks, and see whether there is some common development. And if you get common development, then you can ask yourself, what do those tasks have in common? And then get some information about how the mind is composed. Okay? And so what I latched on is that tasks that have to do with perspective, they seem to form one group that have some common development. And in order to pursue this, the mental files are useful, as I said earlier on, in understanding what a perspective is, and gives you a notion of perspective that you can apply to quite different tasks. Okay. So, what about perspectives? What do we roughly know when children can handle those? This was actually one of the earliest things that was theory of mind before it was called that, how it was investigated. So here is a slide that shows you what has been sort of investigated. So the one central thing here is the false belief task. Right? I will tell you again what it is, but you know from our first talk today. And this is sort of a cognitive perspective taking, so that understanding what people believe, what cognitive perspective a person has on the world. And then there are some other ones. So here is one, maybe the oldest one, that came out of Piaget's work, done by, or later done by John Flavel, who showed a sort of, to children, a turtle. And the children realized, well, I explain it to you a bit later. So this is a visual perspective taking, and the child understands that he sees it upside up, whereas the child sees it currently lying on its back. Okay? And there are other things, also Flavel's task about appearance reality. When I show it to you, you think it's a rock. When I then throw it at you, you get terrified and realize this is just soft sponge and doesn't hurt. But children then also know that it's a piece of sponge, but can't tell you that by looking at it, it looks like a rock, until they pass the false belief test. And here are some other things like ambiguous figures relates to the false belief task, false direction signs, identity task, I will tell you more about that, and about that. Two, that is alternative naming of something. And so the question, alternative naming, what the hell does that have to do with perspective taking? Okay, psycholinguists talked about it in that way, but why are they justifying it? So those are the questions, but there is a, and all of those tasks here sort of lasted around 4 years. And by now, most of them have also, there's at least one experiment that correlated it with false belief, and they correlate even when you take out age or some intelligence measure. Okay. So here, level 2, perspective taking. Most of you who do developmental work will know this. Okay, so here this is actually John Flavel. He is older years. So he sees it on its feet. The child understands when you turn this around, then it's on its feet, but looking at it this way, it's on its back. But when the child then sees it, the pre-4-year-old child sees it that way, can't say that John will see it standing on its feet. Okay. So that is the thing. Then the false belief task, well, just briefly, we didn't use Sally and Anne originally, but Max and his mother. So Max puts his piece of chocolate into box 1. While he's away, somebody transfers it into box 2. Then he comes back, and the question, simple question is, where will he look for his chocolate? Okay. So in order to correctly say in box 1, I save you the embarrassment to ask you where he will look. Then, in order to give the correct answer, you have to understand that he has a different perspective on what's going on here than you, as the person who has seen the whole story, has. Okay? So, from your perspective, it's in box 2. From his, it's in box 1. Okay. So that's how those things link. Now, there are some psycholinguists, notable Eve Clark and Mike Tomasello. I found some nice quote. So let's just read one to you. When speakers plan an utterance, they choose a specific perspective on what they wish to speak about. This perspective, marked by word choice, allows them to present to their addressee a specific conceptualization of an object. Blah, blah, blah. Depending on one's conversational goal, one might refer to the family dog as either Rover, our dog, the collie, the destroyer of shoes, and so on. Okay? And however you refer to it, it puts a different perspective on it. Okay? And Mike Tomasello said something similar. But then the question is, before I ask the critical question, first that we, for totally different reasons, did some experiment where we wanted to test whether false belief understanding is a more general understanding of representations. So we wanted to find a linguistic analog to it, that they have to understand that words not just mean something, but also they have a form which can be different and still mean something the same, so like synonyms. So it started with synonyms. Later we discovered it also works with terms like animal and rabbit. So the synonyms idea went out. And so it works something like this. I say a name, and you have to, first you test for children whether they know the two names for this thing, whether they're familiar with that you want to use. So do you test that when you ask them, you have this here and some other objects, which one is the rabbit? They point to this one. And then this one appears again with other objects, and you ask where is the bunny? Then they also point to this one. Or where is the animal? If it's the only animal, they pick that up. So you know that they agree with you that this can be referred to as a bunny or as a rabbit or an animal. Okay, and then you say, now we play again. I call it a rabbit. And you have, if I call it a rabbit, you have to say the other name, not the one I just said. Okay, so I call it a rabbit, now you say the other thing. Or you do it the other way around. I say it's an animal. What do you say? Okay? And the data show that, I think is the green line here, that the young 3-year-olds, so those are sort of 3 to 3.5 or something, they are pretty hopeless at this. Okay? And then it goes up, and by about 4 or 5, they're getting quite good. And the red line here is a good old false belief test. And you see that they the developmental trajectory is very similar, okay? Which doesn't mean that they correlate, but they also correlate quite strongly if you. So, and there are lots of data now, and they all turn out the correlation is always quite high. You may say this has to do with the complexity of this. If I say this, you have to say that, and the other way around. That's a bit much for young 3-year-olds, one would think. But no, if you do it not with rabbit animal, but for instance with rabbit and its color, or with 2 colors, this ball is yellow and green, then the blue lines show you performance on those. Even the young 3-year-olds can manage. Okay. So then the question is, so a nice explanation of this is that it is has to do with perspective, right? And we can say, well, the psycholinguists say this has to do with perspective, and children are bad at perspective before age 4. That's why they fail on on this task and on false belief, and around 4 it changes. Okay. But the question is, yeah, they say perspective, but it's not very easy to see what's common there. Is it really the same notion of perspective we're talking about? Okay. So, for instance, to make it clear, one characteristic of visual perspective and cognitive perspective here is that if one sees it on its back and the other sees it on its feet, you can't put the two together, then it is on its feet and it's on its back at the same time. Okay? To get a contradiction here. The same for the false belief test. If in one perspective it's in box 1, in the other one in box 2, you can't mix the two together, conjoin them, and say it's in box 1 and 2. Okay? So if this characterizes this kind of perspective, but if you say this is a rabbit, and the other one says this is an animal, then it is an animal and a rabbit at the same time. So here no contradiction. Okay? So this is one thing that are we talking about the same kind of perspective. So that's where mental files come in. So first, a little break here and tell you about what mental files are in principle. They are what philosophers call that you have a representation of any particular thing. In our examples here, they're always sort of physical objects. It makes it easier than abstract things you can think about. So, so that's how the idea works. Let's say there is an object here, like this die here, and here is a sentient being that has looks at this file, at this die. So there is a causal relation if this person here can perceive it, and that is the seeing is an epistemically rewarding thing because you get to get some information about the object. Okay, so if a person has a epistemically rewarding relation like seeing to an object, then that creates some mental activity, namely it creates a file for this object. Okay? And I very concretely represent this with a filing cabinet file. So this is the mental file, and the mental file represents that object. Okay? So you can say this refers to this object here, and as we will see later, its task is to track this object over time. And then this object is called the referent of the file. Okay. And if you don't just look at it at this and have a representation of it, but you encode it as a die, you conceptualize it as a die, this object, then this must also be marked on this file here. So you say this is, so this blue thing marks that this here refers to that as a die, as being a die. Okay. Then what else do we need? So this is the conceptual label here. Then, since you're looking at it, you get also visual information that will be copied on the file, very important, to find the die again later. Then you also will have probably some sort of verbalizable information, conceptual information, that it is white, has black dots on it, and so on. What else? Yeah, so here they have information about the object, and that's an interesting distinction between this is information about the object, versus, whereas the file itself represents this object. Okay? And it represents this object independently of what information it has on it. Okay. Anything else? Right, but this information it has, the file has on it about the object, is important for tracking the object over time. Okay? Because if the die disappears and then comes back, I need this information to determine whether it's the same file as this, and I should use this file to encode more information about it. Okay. So that's what mental files are supposed to be, a very general theory about how we think about particular objects. Okay, so here is a summary of the functions it has. So the function, the mental file itself is a representation of an object. It has the function to track the object in the world in order to be able to re-identify the target at later locations, to collect information about the object or bind the properties, all the properties it has to this target object. It allows for non-satisfactional reference. I will spare you this. This is interest to philosophers. Okay, but they can ask questions about it. Then it also has sort of interesting features. Then it brings out the predicative structure of language, namely a distinction between what one talks or thinks about and what one says about this thing that one thinks about. Okay, so this is reflected by the file and the information that's on the file. Okay. And there is also the possibility of multiple filing. That's the important thing for us. Namely, I said a file refers to the object that it represents. Okay? Now if you have two files for the same object, then you have co-referential files. So that's what co-referential means. You have more than one file for the same object. Okay? So in that, okay. And this one is claimed captures differences of perspective. So as soon as you have two files for the same object, you have two different perspectives of the same object. And also this raises identity problems. So when you give the identity statements that somebody is something, somebody else, and that is only comes up when you have co-referential files. Okay, so what are co-referential files? And the importance of linking co-referential files. So here is a nice example that John Kerry used about Ernst Mach. You know the speed of sound. Mach. So Mach lived in Vienna, enters a bus in Vienna and sees, as he enters the bus, a man at the other end of the bus. And he thinks, this is a shabby pedagogue. Okay? So it happens that who he sees is actually himself in the mirror. Okay? So you could say Mach at this point has a piece of self-knowledge because he has knowledge about himself. But it isn't really what we mean by self-knowledge. Okay? Because he doesn't really yet know that this guy he sees is himself, or a reflection of himself. Okay, it applies to himself. And this can be captured that you have two independent notions of, or he has two independent notions of himself, or files. Okay. So in file terminology, as he has, of course, a long-standing file of himself, a self file, or Mach file, where he has all his whatever he knows about himself in it. And then he sees this man. The reflection was caused by him, and the reflection causes this file here. So this is a file that refers to him. And he knows of this man that he is a shabby and he's a pedagogue. Okay. But what is missing for it being real, genuine self-knowledge? That comes about when he realizes that it is his own mirror image. Then he can think, oh, I'm that man, I'm a shabby pedagogue. Okay? And this is captured by the files that you have self-knowledge you gain through linking. So that you get a link here through this realization, and that links the two files. That one function of the link is that you can now bring this information here in with the single file. Okay. So here you have, okay. So that shows you why linking is very important. So you can know something about the same object, but not realizing that what you know is of the same object. So, a theory of mind and dual naming. How to say, why to say link together can be now explained with these mental files. So here, the idea of how theory of mind is captured by mental files is, and that's an assumption that I sort of latched on by trying to explain our data. And François Recanati, a philosopher, had a similar idea, but a now more better worked out idea to solve the philosophical problems of belief statements. So the idea is, at this point in the story, you have a critical file about the chocolate. And it says that it's inside box 2. And whenever you track, there's another person and you want to track his perspective, you make up a co-referential file for this object. They're called vicarious files, a special type of co-referential file. And in this file, it also represents the very same chocolate, but the information you put in is not what you know, but what Maxi knows. Okay? And the links are sometimes called vertical links instead of horizontal links in the other case, between regular files. Okay, so that's how you capture another person's perspective, and if that's the way you do it, then you get a problem of dealing with co-referential files, right? And if you call this here, you conceptualize this entity as a rabbit, then you get this file. But if you then reconceptualize it as an animal, you get a new file. Okay? So you can well be able to sort of conceptualize it in both ways, so you get two files. But without linking, you won't really understand that you're talking about the same object, even though to us it's more than obvious. So in order, okay, so here, unless you can link the files, you have a problem, because if you say this is a rabbit, and what else can it be, then here it only gives you, it's a rabbit. It's only when you can link files that you can understand, I could conceptualize it differently, and then I get it's also an animal. In the control conditions, let's say about the red and green, you don't have to get this problem, because yellow and green, being yellow and green doesn't create different files. It's just one file for the ball, and you say about the ball that it's yellow and also green. So if I instruct you to say, if I say yellow, you have to say green, you can do this without the ability of having to link files. Okay? So that's why linking the files gives us an explanation. Okay, so you have to link those files, then you can play the game. So taking stock, the co-referential files give you different perspectives. So we have here a notion of perspective that applies to belief as well as alternative naming. Okay? So a justification for why those psycholinguists talk about different perspectives. Then co-referential files, you can have them. Then you have the different perspectives available, but only when you can link them, then you have an understanding that there are different perspectives one can have. Okay? And the claim to this that at around 4 years, it happens that they acquire the ability to link files. So this is not linked sort of static on 4 years. This may depend on all sorts of things. But whenever the age, which just happens to be around 4, one thing is acquired, the other one can be acquired. hinges on this common ability. So then the prediction is, if that understanding identity statements should also not be possible before age 4. And that is a prediction that came out of my earlier version of this. And this we tested in various ways, but here is one. So a little story. Here comes the firefighter. He opens this door and goes inside. And here comes Peter. He has found a bag. Peter asks the dog whose bag it is. The dog says it belongs to Mr. Müller. He is inside the house. Okay? Now, let's say the story continues. Peter rings the bell, the door opens, and he sees 2 people. Who should he give the bag to? Wouldn't know. No, yeah, we know who he. No, who will he give the bag to, right? You couldn't. You wouldn't know who the bag belongs to. Okay, but the dog was actually friendlier than I was. He gave an identity statement. Mr. Müller is the firefighter, right? Now, in mental state terms, at this point of the story, this information creates a file for the firefighter. Then the next information tells you there is also a man involved. That's name is Mr. Müller, and he owns this bag here. But you have no way of knowing what he looks like, and so you couldn't identify him if you saw him. With this information here, something important changes, namely, this creates a link between those 2 notions, and that you can link the 2 files. With this, you can transfer the information from the firefighter file, the visual information, to the man file, and then you can sort of anchor that file to the same person when you see him. Right? So with this information, you can then know that the bag should be given to this person or the other. Okay? So the claim is children below 4 who don't pass the false belief test won't be able to process the information. And the evidence comes out quite well. So the green thing here is how they do on this here. In fact, I think if it's over 2 stories, the guessing rate should be about 20, I don't know. It's actually, there's a slight tendency that they give it to the other person, because if this is the firefighter, then Mr. Müller is probably the other person. But in any case, only by about 4 or 5, around 5 years, they tend to get perfect. It's also that they can remember at the point who the firefighter is. That might be a problem, but that is tested in this blue thing. And if you say, make the story so that you don't never see the firefighter, just Peter comes with the bag, and the dog says that belongs to the firefighter. This says that is Mr. Müller. He is a firefighter, and then Peter opens the door and sees this person and one dressed as a firefighter. Then blue line, they have no problem knowing who the bag belongs to. Okay, so understanding that Mr. Müller is a firefighter is not difficult. It's only difficult to have the identity between already 2 existing people, like Mr. Müller is the firefighter. Okay. And interestingly, but you already know why that's interesting. If you do a false belief test, then the performance goes up like on the identity condition, right? And they also correlate quite nicely, even when you partial out age and a verbal IQ test. So far, development at 4. The critical thing is to link co-referential files. It explains why false belief, alternative naming, and identity statements develop at the same time and correlate well. And what would be most timely extensions of this theory is to see how, by work out the theory, why that should apply to visual perspective taking, appearance reality task. Also there is a homonymity task. Have to speed up a bit. Why it doesn't apply to pretense, and that can be mastered earlier. Those are all theoretically important questions for the philosophers in here to work on. There's also empirical investigations that are very timely. Namely, would it also apply not only to identity statements, but also to numerical identity, namely children's ability to understand equations. Okay. Now, second order. That is known as when they have to understand beliefs about beliefs. This has been tested in various ways some time ago. So here is sort of a more elegant version that you can just tack on to the good old false belief test. So we do the false belief test, but then we have two questions. The first order question is a sort of slightly changed belief test. If we ask Max, where is your chocolate? What will he say? Okay. So then by 4, definitely by 5, most children will say, he will say it's in box 1. Second order question is, if we ask Max, do you know where your chocolate is? What will he say? Will he say, yes, I know, or I don't know? And then children who already give the correct answer to 1, so between 4 and 6, there are many children who then give the wrong answer and say, he will say, no, I don't know it. Okay. But they should say, I hope you agree, yes, I know it. Because, but in order to understand this, it's a second order problem, because you have to understand what Max believes about his belief, that his belief is a piece of knowledge and not a wrong belief. Okay? So we get children who get the first order and the second order wrong. The ones who get the first order correct and the second order, they don't get yet, and they're both correct on both. Okay. And now the interesting, so those are the data that, so you see the first order by 4, 10 here, in this sample they were perfect, and the older ones too, but the second order thing, they are lag behind. And the blue bar shows you something. If you have a different version where you also have Mary around, you can ask what Mary thinks about John's knowledge. And it's also second order, and it goes with this red bar here. Okay, so that's how we know that second order tasks are somewhat more difficult. And this can be applied to a problem that's known as intentionality. Maybe not quite in the original sense, but it has to do with the understanding that what somebody believes depends on under which description the person knows, or under which conceptualization the person knows of the object. Okay, you will get clear. So this was a very nice experiment. The first one who did this, but very explicitly verbal, was Jim Russell. But Ian Appley and Elizabeth Robinson did a sort of neat developmental version that use dual objects. You have an eraser and another eraser, but this is a die that's made out of rubber. Okay? Now I tell you, you're the children, that we have this eraser, and this is also a eraser and a die. Okay. Then Heinz comes in, and we show him that we put this object in here and that object into there. Okay. And those are, okay. Then you can ask the no question. Does Heinz know that the die is an eraser? And the children between 4 and 6 roughly, most of them understand that he can see that this is an eraser, he can see that this is a die, but he can't see that this is an eraser, okay, because he was demonstrating that it is. Okay. So if you do it twice the same task but with different material, then in this, one of our replications of their results shows that 16 children say correctly, no, he doesn't know that on both occasions. But when the story continues, and Heinz wants to do a drawing, and you ask the action question, sorry, he does a drawing. He wants to erase something because he did it wrong. Action question, where will Heinz look for an eraser? Then those children who said here twice, gave twice the correct answer that he doesn't know, that this is an eraser, still send him half the time to look for an eraser here. Okay? So this is, especially for philosophers, a very irrational combination of things. So there are various explanations one could use here. But it's an interesting explanation that comes from the mental files. So the basic underlying idea here is that children pass first order tasks before second order. And here you could say they're quite good of understanding which object has the agent a conception of, or has a file for it. Okay? But they are still not very good at second order understanding, namely under which conception does the agent conceive of the object. Okay? So this makes it sort of intuitively second order, and that's what they have a problem with. So how does this work? Bear with me. So you see, you know that there is this object here, and it's an eraser, and it is put into box 1. You know of this object that it is a die, that it is put into box 2. It's also an eraser. It rolls quietly, because it's very confirmed. But it also is an eraser, so therefore you have a second file for it, a co-referential file. You also know that it's in box 2 and that it's also a die, and it smudges the paper, because as a die it's not so great, because it's, as an eraser, because it smudges the paper. Okay. So you can see you'll put the eraser relevant information on here, and sorry, the die relevant information on here, and the eraser relevant information on there, and the information that's relevant for both on both. Okay, now the question is, the idea is that you see that Heinz sees this object. Okay, so that is good grounds for making a vicarious file for the eraser, because Heinz can see this is an eraser, and therefore you make this thing, and he can see that it's put into box 1, so therefore make this vicarious file. Now the question is, what should you do with your co-referential files when it comes to Heinz? So he sees this object here being put into here. So therefore, seeing the object creates a vicarious file for this. Okay. And he also sees this object. That's the same object as for this file here. So therefore, and that's the error the younger children commit, they also make a vicarious file of their for the eraser, for the object as an eraser, because it's a second order problem to understand that he can't conceive of the eraser as an eraser. Right? He only can conceive of this object as a die. Right? So therefore, they can't stop this, because this is a second order problem. Whereas when you ask them, does he know that the die, okay, but they are first order sophisticated, so they already understand that from just looking at this, you can't know that it is an eraser. So therefore, they don't put is an eraser on the vicarious file. So when asked, does he know that this is an eraser, they look here, no information, therefore they say correctly no. But when you ask, now he needs an eraser, where will he look? There are two eraser files, for this eraser and for the die eraser. So therefore, they have no grounds to prefer this one, so therefore they give you 50-50 any one of them. Okay? So that's how this can explain those data, which are quite sort of weird data. So we've followed this up. There are further data. For instance, we could show that how the file management works here, that it depends on timing and the modality. So the vicarious eraser file, this wrong deferment here, only happens when Heinz sees the object when the child already knows about the eraser. Okay? When Heinz sees the object and the child is only told later that it's also an eraser, then they are pretty good at this. They don't make the error. Okay? It's also when Heinz sees it, and the child does not yet know about the eraser, but also when Heinz is only told about a die. Okay? Because then they realize that he has only information about a die, and that only generates a die file, so they're only given a vicarious die file, but not the eraser file. So only in this condition here, they make the error, but not in those conditions. This is also very useful, this finding, because it rules out a set of alternative explanations for that finding. In particular, Hannes Rakoczi recently latched onto this, which is interesting for theoretical reasons, that he is, as a Tomasello disciple, he is in the tradition to analyze mental state attribute or theory of mind in terms of the component concepts. So the idea is that when passing the false belief test means they have acquired a concept of belief, and therefore he didn't like, the idea that at the time they pass the false belief test, then certain aspects of the concept of belief are not yet mastered, namely the intentionality. Okay. So he tried to show that by making the task different, easier, then that you get, at the time they pass the false belief test, they can also do intentionality in his version. But we then could show that his version doesn't really require doesn't have the problem of suppressing the so what in the typical task what you have to do is to have to suppress the identity between the two things, and in order not to attribute the second identity to the other agent. But in his problem, in his task, that problem is not required. But we could then show that they have an inverse problem of understanding when he does know about the identity, that they should attribute knowledge of those things, and they don't. So, and this also has an interesting implication for Marco's talk this morning about what it means to have a concept of belief. Okay, so here we have a representational theory of what it means to have a belief, but it doesn't mean that you get the concept yes or no. It just depends on this file management. Okay, and in any case, I'm not sure anymore. I know what it means to have a concept of belief. Is it just that you can manage those files correctly, give the right answers, or is something more needed? So it's also useful for this. Okay, so I'm running a bit late. How much? Okay.
Make it 7 minutes.
Okay, fine. Yeah. Okay. So I also want to show you something about brain imaging. So I get the impression when reading this stuff about brain imaging that there seemed to be, it sort of started with modularity again, right? So the early brain imaging, everybody was trying to find a module for this and that. Now they're going away from this and talking about networks, because there was several reasons involved when you do something. But now they're talking of networks, and there is definitely a theory of mind network. There's sort of a language network, and there's of course controversy about whether it is or not, but there are still some people who firmly try to show that this is fairly independent of other processing networks. And there also is let's say, a numerical brain or a numerical network. So they're conceived of as basically independent, but of course they have to cooperate. If I give you a verbal maths task, then your numerical network has to cooperate with your language understanding network. But whatever the network does internally is independent of the other network. Okay. But now I have if that is so, then we have a problem making our developmental data across the sort of the co-development across different domains compatible with what we know about the brain. Because if those are independent things, in particular, we'll show you data about the language network and numerical network, why identity is understood in both at the same time. Okay, so if they're independent, then why should there be a co-development, if that is the thing? So the potential answer then would be that the networks, to some degree, they're independent, but also for certain particular problems, they may share neural specialists. Let's call the one for us the ability to link co-referential files. Okay. It's also not implausible that there is a special thing for it, because that linking of files also has a meta-representational flavor. So then with this assumption, we can explain why we get those developmental data, because if we have a knowledge gain in the specialist, or a skill gain in the specialist, and that gain will appear across domains which use that specialist, so depend on that specialist. Okay, so can we find a neural structure that is somehow, at least, is always used when linking is required? So first, there have been already quite a few studies on theory of mind. And my colleague, Matthias Schurz, did not too long ago a meta-analysis where he was able to find enough studies, at least 10 in each group, to compare 6 different groups of tasks that claim to investigate theory of mind. I show you here 3, and you can see there are sort of different patterns, some similarity, but also differences. So one difference that is particularly important for us is this left temporal parietal junction. Okay, so this is the temporal lobe, and this is the parietal one, and where the two meets and the one there, that is thought of core importance for theory of mind at least, but more the right side than the left. But for us, it's more the left. Okay, but you can see here is social animations. Some of you may know them, the hydrosimmal animations, where you see sort of triangles move around, but in a social way. And as soon as you see this, you start mentalizing and say, oh, he wants to go out, and the other one doesn't let him, and so on. Okay, so that's this, then rational actions, that you have to figure out. Somebody does something, you have to infer his intention in order to be able to detect the next picture that would fit that story. And as you notice, they both, all 3 of them activate this left TPJ, but this one more higher up than those 2. Okay, so, but the false belief test is the one test, group of tests, where you can say that really needs different perspectives. Okay? Whereas the other one, there is no necessity for understanding perspective. Okay? So that's why we focused on this upper part here as particularly critical for a perspective. Okay, and then this is our newest thing that we haven't even written up, is that we, one of my students had the idea, well, if we have done something already on identity statements, and that sort of overlaps with the belief regions there in certain parts. But if this has to do with identity, then it also should overlap with equations. Okay? So here are some critical things. This is always the same in my paradigm example here. the dentist goes to his clinic, so they have the dentist. And Lily finds, so the second person, Mr. Dietrich's back, so there's a third person actually. So you think of three people, but you don't really know who Mr. Dietrich is. And then here you get an identity statement. Mr. Dietrich is the dentist. Okay? So that's the critical thing. What brain activity goes on when you process this? So that subjects don't fall asleep. Every so often, every third trial, ask some question. As a control, the dentist goes to his clinic, the same. Lily, again, finds Mr. Dietrich's back. But now you hear that Mr. Dietrich is visiting the dentist. So this is sort of linguistically close, but it makes very clear that this Mr. Dietrich can't be identical with the dentist. And here we did it this way. You have two sort of mathematical expressions. You're asked to compute the result so that as a check that you actually did, every third trial or something, you have to say, are both results greater than 20? Okay. Or some similar question. The same here. The only difference between those two things, conditions here, is that here the result happens to be the same, and here it's different. Okay? And see whether that makes a difference, that when you happen to see that it's identical, your identity brain, processing brain gets activated. Okay. So then this is the result. So from earlier research we already expected that it will be this upper, this is the temporal junction here, that the upper part is involved here. But only on the left side. That's also a curious finding. False belief activates on both, but all the identity stuff and other things, they only, or episodic memory, which also has to do with it, only on the left side. Okay, and here the red one is the activation we found for the identity statements, the linguistic thing, and the blue one for the equations. So there are also other blue areas, but this one here overlaps with this one. That's the magenta, I think this color is called. Okay, so you see a direct overlap in each individual. And also another target region was this part of the precuneus, which is a medial thing because the cortex goes here and then inside. And precuneus is in there. You see the red one almost completely overlapping with the blue one, the equations. Okay. This one is maybe an artifact of a weird thing because it's sort of in the colossum part, so it's not clear what this is. Okay. That's how this goes. Okay. So now what this shows is from the meta-analysis where false belief studies activate in the left TPJ. That is green here. Okay? And you see that exactly the upper part here overlaps with our overlap of the equation and statement studies. Okay? What this is the TPJ activation for the other tasks I showed you that don't require perspective differences. And you see that is below. It's only that section of the false belief tasks that is outside what it shares with the other tasks that overlaps with the okay. Anything else? Okay, this is this region here. Particular also with the precuneus, similar thing. This yellow thing here overlap with the blue here. But the three things, the statements, the equations, and the false belief overlap here. Okay. What's happening? That should go. Nothing.
Should I try the keyboard?
Yeah. Okay. So does it go down? Ah. Something blue. Yeah.
No, to jest.
Not one more, two. Ah, okay.
Isn't there? Hold on a minute, you can't say that.
He can only come in for the discussion.
He's trying to say what
Okay. So that was this here. So the upshot is that we have a domain-specific network shared that processes the linking for referential files. And the location is the things I showed you. So there is the networks that deal with identity, like language, maps, and also other things you can explain it for memory, like face recognition, recollection. They share these areas, and the tasks that deal with perspective-sensitive processes, like theory of mind, false belief, and so on, also share this region. There is also meta-analysis of visual perspective, and there also overlaps with those regions. And also we have looked at false direction signs, which are non-mental but also create different perspectives. They also overlap with those regions. Okay. So the implication relevant for us, they alleged that we can now explain why developmental progress across domains correlates and why this is possible, because there's a brain region that changes and that creates the commonality. So the take-home message that you can write home is a common development of tasks, first order linking of files between 3 and 5 years, explains identity, perspective, tasks, and so on, why they hang together. It extends to second order as a slightly later development, that they understand beliefs about beliefs, or beliefs about knowledge, with this delay, and it correlates with understanding intentionality. And then there is a common brain regions for first order tasks. At those regions, the identity statements and equations activate there, false belief, false signs, visual perspective, and episodic memory overlaps with those regions. And this game is calling or something. Okay, that's the end. Thank you very much.